Rob, when he was Minister of Climate and Energy, he passed a climate law which turned the CO2 targets into law. So rather than saying we just set it as a target, he turned it into law. We have a legal obligation as a country to reach our climate goal. But it's not without reason that Shell decided to move their main headquarters from the Netherlands to the UK. It was like we always called it a Dutch-British company. We now don't see it as a Dutch company anymore.
Hello, it's Michael Gove here, editor of The Spectator. Alongside Wolf Power Club, we'll be holding a fantastic energy conference on Monday the 24th of November. We'll be bringing together people from politics, from industry and from the third sector to discuss the future of energy here in the UK and across the world. Get your tickets now.
Ladies and gentlemen, one of our biggest audiences is the Netherlands, or known more commonly in the UK, Holland, even though Ad can tell us the difference between those two in a second. But a shock has happened in the last week. A politician that's not extreme right or extreme anything has suddenly got the highest amount of seats in their parliamentary election. And today, not only are we going to look at if you're not Dutch, you're not much. We're also going to look at why this energy of a country of less than 25 million people is one of the core energy nations in the world, but has just gone for an election of hope, an election of joy. And with us, we have a man who has worked almost 6 years in the past with D66, the Victorious Party. Going on from that, now has a very senior role in the data and energy side of the world at Get Focus, but more importantly to me, was my debating teammate back in the day at the Elijah Beck. So Adriana, can we please welcome you to the Wolf Power Club?
Thank you so much, Alex. It's great to be here and great to be with you again.
So I think let's get straight into the meat. It's not a loving for our listeners of 20 odd years of arguing about things, but I want to understand the political landscape in the Netherlands a bit more. So in much of the Western world, we've seen sort of steady rise of right-wing parties in recent years. Many actually put the Dutch as almost the sort of start of that domino effect when Wilders, who is probably the closest thing to Nigel Farage, you can argue a bit sort of either way, got a huge amount of seats. You then saw Donald Trump's very clear rhetoric about immigration and building walls of Mexico have a clean sweep over Kamala Harris. And yet, in the Netherlands last week, D66, and I know some of the votes are still being counted, but in terms of from all perspectives, D66 have taken a narrow victory and will be given the opportunity to form the Dutch coalition. So how did that happen? And what does it say about Dutch politics today? Because it certainly shocked us in the UK that a more centre party has just taken the lead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the Netherlands, in a sense, has been a bit of the forefront of the right populist development in Europe. It even started back in 2002 when a guy called Pim Fortuyn was the first right-wing populist leader who got assassinated a couple of weeks before the 2002 elections. But his party still created a major upset, and since 2002, so for over 2 decades already, the Netherlands has gone on that trajectory of right-wing populism. So I think a lot of the examples we see with reform in the UK, with Alternatief for Deutschland, in Germany, with Trump, all across Europe, I think the Netherlands has been a bit of the benchmark for it, if you will. So in that sense, potentially last week's victory for D66 can also be that benchmark. And I think there are 2 main reasons why that happened. One is a more like local politics kind of issue. The last coalition government is the first time that the Freedom Party, the right-wing party by Geert Wilders, was the biggest party in the Netherlands. They formed a very right-wing 4-party coalition government. And a lot of people were thinking that that would be perhaps not the most popular government, but at least a government, because they were all relatively right-wing parties, a government that would get things done. And they really didn't. They were marked by infighting. They were marked by only being focused on sending out the tweets that would get you like plus 2% point in the polls. They really didn't get anything done. The coalition government toppled after 2 years when one party dropped out. Then a couple of months later, another party dropped out. So it kept going and going and going. I think so that's part of it. It's just the unpopularity of the last coalition government. But the other part, and I think that's very fundamental, and that can be a blueprint for parties across Europe as well, is D66 ran a inherently optimistic can-do kind of campaign. I think like the slogan, if you would translate it literally, would be something like "It is possible." I think you could also translate it into "Yes, we can," which might resonate with your listeners slightly. There was a lot of copying from the Obama 08 blueprint as well, but it was very much aimed at creating a more centrist approach after 25 years of right-wing populism and infighting. Let's see how we can get things done, because obviously the right has been shouting a lot in the Netherlands but not getting anything done. So that frame of "it is possible" had come well in Dutch, I think really resonated with people as well. It was a very positive, optimistic kind of framing.
And was anything offered? Because we all know in elections, we've both done a lot of time. You've done time in the US as well as the Netherlands. I'm a stalwart of the UK. I've absolutely loved it. The last 30 years, you always see me at a count or knocking on some doors or getting opinion. And we've just done all the political conferences. But did D66 give any giveaway ways, whether it was cool tax cuts or whether it was job opportunities, or what was the thing that suddenly someone said, actually, we will choose D66 over some of the other central candidates?
I think one of the major political issues in the Netherlands right now is a housing crisis. We've been building too few houses for decades now. People are struggling, even waiting for years to move out of their parents' house to find a new place. And I think that one thing that triggered a lot of people, it might be a bit of a pie in the sky kind of pipe dream, but D66 said we're going to build 10 new cities in the Netherlands. Now, I know you lived in the Netherlands for a long time. It's a small, relatively, there's not a lot of space left anymore to build 10 new cities. So I think people are going to be, wondering where those 10 new cities are going to happen. But the idea, and I think it tied into that broader narrative. So parties have been toppling over each other, explaining why it's impossible to build new houses and why it's never happening. And D66 said, let's just build 10 new houses. Half of our country used to be below sea level. We've claimed the land. We've built whole new parts of the country in the sea. Why not do it again? Let's build new cities. So one of the ideas is build a new city between Amsterdam and Almere. That's currently, it used to be a sea, now it's a lake, and it's going to be a city according to the D66 campaign. And I think that kind of mentality, let's stop talking about what's impossible and let's start talking about what is possible, like 10 new cities, I think really resonated with people.
A party is nothing without its leader. I think we've always seen that get the right leader in charge of a party, it can suddenly have massive effects. And whatever people say in the UK, you can see over the last sort of 2 or 3 decades, if you get the right person that can land a message, it suddenly takes the party to a different world. Now, can you tell us a little bit more, because he's not that well known in the UK? I think it's fair to say in the UK, we all know Mark Rutte from all his various international roles, and he was our big mate during Brexit, making sure it wasn't too bad. But we don't know much about, I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Rob Jetten, or would you say Rob Jetten?
Jetten. Yeah, you're pretty close. Rob Jetten is fine. Yeah.
So tell us a bit about Rob, and obviously what can we expect from his leadership? And I was just interested, know your perspectives of what Rob brings to Netherlands as a country, but also internationally. What can we expect?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, he's a young guy. He's younger than you and me, Alex. We're at that age that prime ministers are younger than we are. So he's 38. He's a young guy. He's always been a great talent within the party. He was the chairman of the youth party, so the youth division of the party. Back when he was a student, he got elected to city council in the city of Nijmegen when he was only 23 years old. He got elected to parliament when he was only 30 years old. So although he's young, he's been a member of parliament for 8 years, or He's been in politics for those 8 years. He's been Minister of Energy and Climate for 2 years, the last Rutte coalition in that time frame as well. He was elected the head of the delegation in Parliament when he was only 31 years old. So after 1 year in Parliament, he was already elected as chosen as the head of the party delegation. So he is always seen as very much as a young, talented, eloquent debater, a guy that can really get his message across. But it didn't play out in the beginning very well. So when he got elected when he was 30, he became party leader when he was 31. And at the time, he sounded very scripted, very rehearsed. So when he took over, the nickname that he got as party leader in Parliament was actually Robot Jetten, because he kept repeating the same things over and over again in the same words, so very scripted. So it took him a bit of time to get the hang of it, to lose a bit of his. I think he's a very talented communicator, but he was so focused on not making mistakes in the beginning that he lost a bit of his authenticity, and that's really what he was able to reclaim over the last couple of years. And he's very authentic now and very genuine. And I think he is a charismatic young guy. One of the things that's interesting about him, and if you look at political trends across the world, he's going to be our first openly gay prime minister. He's getting married next year to a guy who is on the Argentinian national field hockey team, who participated in both the Tokyo and the Paris Olympics. But he doesn't make a big theme out of it. So yes, he's openly gay. But he is not about being woke for the sake of being woke. It's just part of who he is. And I think that resonates with a lot of people. He's focused on not on the symbolism of these kind of issues. Like the Netherlands, as you know, is a pretty tolerant country when it comes to individual liberties, whether it's, on medical issues or on sexuality or whatever. But he doesn't make a big theme out of it. It's just who he is. And I think that really works for people as well.
Now, we love in the media world and the energy world of trying to compare him to someone we might know. Am I right in saying that a bit like in sort of around sort of 2008, 2010 election, when David Cameron came in with a lot of hope, a lot of the economy, and I think actually most people would say we'd love a bit of Cameron back now. I'm sure I'm going to get lots of comments and stuff. Would you say he's like a David Cameron, or would you say his politics is very different? The only reason I raise it is that Cameron was very economic focused, very open to all. So he took a traditional part out of the Conservative Party to say, let's get past this whole legality of gay marriage stuff, but and was very international looking. Would you say it's a fair comparison, or would you say he's very much like someone else? Because obviously in the UK press, we always compare Wilders and Farage. I was just wondering where Rob sits on people that our UK listeners could work with. Was he more Tony Blair-esque?
Well, I think a lot of people have been, obviously also with the Yes We Can kind of campaign, people have been trying to compare him to Obama, also to Justin Trudeau in Canada. I do think your comparison, especially for the style of communication with David Cameron, makes sense. A lot of people have also been looking, and you said it jokingly, but to the Tony Blair comparison, because obviously Blair with New Labour created after the Thatcher years, created a more less idealistic approach to labor. I think Rob Jetten also moved a bit away from idealism for the purpose of dogmatism. Let's be a bit more pragmatic, get a bit more of an economic message in there, but also create a bit of hope. So I think that distinction, Tony Blair versus the Thatcher years, I think also works a bit with Jetten versus the Rutte and Wilders years. But I do think his style of communication, Jette is approachable. He has a strong sense of humor. I think these two also very much apply to someone like David Cameron. Doesn't take himself too serious. So when he embraced, I used the Robot Jetten example, he's embraced it. So he hasn't run away from it. He makes jokes about the fact that he was robotic. And the other thing is he was called in the beginning, when he was Minister of Energy and Climate, he was called a bit of in Dutch you would say drama, a bit pushy, a bit, I really want people to become sustainable. And rather than, and people used it against him and they called him a climate pusher. And then he made a a shirt which says, "I'm a climate pusher." So rather than running away from it, he embraced it. So I think he doesn't take himself too seriously, which people really resonate with as well. And I think that also works a bit for Cameron. Yeah.
And he came leader very young, as you've told us. You were in the party for 6 years, so there must have been a significant amount of time around Rob. Just before we move on to the energy industry, did you see a guy that you thought would be Prime Minister of this country, and did you see a guy that you thought would beat Wilders? Because at one point it seemed that there's so much momentum behind Wilders over the last 10 years, or so. I was just interested, did you see him coming Prime Minister? Because there's one thing leading a party that's got a stake in the coalition. There's another thing coming Prime Minister. Did you see that coming?
I would love to claim to be the visionary who saw it all coming. I have to admit, I was doubtful, not for the person of Rob yet. It was always clear as soon as even when he was still like a member of city council, he was always one of those few names. I think the number 2 on the list, Jan Paternotte, at the same time was also a member of city council in Amsterdam, and he's now the number 2 in parliament. These were always like the big names that were coming up through the ranks within the party. So everyone knew that, but I think the idea that he would really get to that point that he could become prime minister, I was doubtful even as far back as a couple of weeks ago, before the momentum started surging. Like you said, like some votes still need to be counted. Because I don't live in the Netherlands anymore, my vote still has to be counted because I had to send in a mail-in ballot from Germany. So I'm one of those people whose votes were being counted. But when I voted 3 or 4 weeks ago, it was clear that we were going to get a good result. It wasn't clear that we were going to get a good result to the level that we were going to beat Wilders. So that was a surprise. There's a picture going around that was made by ANP, so the press office during election night, that has made it to the Guardian, and it's made it to New York Times and everything, and it's me. Like, I was really utterly surprised. You can see the surprise on my face if you look at the Guardian. Yeah,
we'll pop up the picture now for our listeners watching this on YouTube. For those who are not listening on YouTube, subscribe to YouTube and watch it twice.
Absolutely.
Then I really want, we have over 70 countries listening to us. We have some of the biggest world energy leaders listening to us. Let's go on to the energy industry and the impact for the Netherlands. And I was recently in the Netherlands back in the spring. I was at a big storage terminals conference of the tank storage event in Rotterdam. And there was actually a buzz in the room. Like, what was interesting was that some energy conferences that go around Europe, there's a lot of nervousness about things like hydrogen, but there was a buzz about the ammonia production that Netherlands already does and how it could be piped to Germany. And this was before the election result. And obviously you've got a long history with companies like Shell, but also most major energy companies in the world have leading divisions of their businesses in the Netherlands, whether it's for the talent that you guys provide from your universities or whether it's the engineering expertise. You guys are heavyweights when it comes to the energy sector, and thank you to our listeners, because the Netherlands is always in our top 5 listening countries. So just interesting, with the D66-led government, you've already touched upon that actually Rob, as Prime Minister, has previously had shadow roles in energy and climate. Do you think it would be a good time for investment of energy, tax regimes with D66 coming in, or a nervous time? Over to you, Ed.
But I'm biased, of course, so I'm definitely going to say good times. But there's a few things. I think, obviously, because he was Minister of Climate and Energy, we already have the blueprint for what his policies are gonna, or what he's gonna push for. Obviously, it's going to be a difficult coalition process. It's going to take at least 4 parties to form a coalition in the Netherlands. It's not going to be done like in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a process of months or years. And obviously, well, not years, but could be, it could be until next year summer before we actually have a coalition government. So, and obviously that does mean you'll get a lot of horse trading. You'll get a lot of input from the different parties. But I think a few things are important. One, Rob, when he was Minister of Climate and Energy, he passed a climate law which turned the CO2 targets into law. So rather than saying we just set it as a target, he turned it into law. We have a legal obligation as a country to reach our climate goals. So for instance, the 2040 90% CO2 emission reduction. That is a European target in the Netherlands that's encoded into law that the country has to reach that, which means that organizations can take and have taken the Dutch government to court to say your policies aren't doing enough to cut carbon emissions. So I think, and that is controversial in the Netherlands, obviously, because you have a democratic process where policies are being set by lawmakers, and then you have organizations taking the Dutch government to court and saying you're not doing enough to reach your own goals. So it's controversial, but it does say a lot about how he's acting. So I think, in contrast to the last government, the right-wing populist government that really moved away from its sustainability and climate targets, you'll see a government that goes back to it. That's going to be vital. He's not going to accept a coalition agreement that doesn't move back towards the CO2 targets. The thing is, if you talk about tax climate, one of the things that the last Rutte government that he was part of did was they created a carbon tax added to the European carbon tax. So on top of the European carbon tax, there was a Dutch added carbon tax. That was removed by the last coalition government, the right-wing populist government. I do think that there's a likeliness, not 100% guarantee, but it's likely that something like that will get back. The idea of the Netherlands as leading the charge in cutting fossil subsidies, fossil fuels, leading the charge in cutting CO2 emissions within Europe is pretty likely. It also means, which is going to be interesting, you know, Wopke Hoekstra is the European Commissioner for climate policy. He did not get any backing from the last Dutch government for his ambitious European climate goals because he was representing the Christian Democratic Party that weren't part of the last coalition government. So he did not get support from his own government. Christian Democrats are the other big winner in this election, also a pretty centrist party. They are very likely to end up in the coalition again. And it seems very likely that now Wopke Hoekstra, as European Climate Commissioner in Europe, will get support from his own government again to really push for ambitious climate goals. And I think that's going to be one of the interesting things going forward. You see Germany moving away from some of the more ambitious climate goals. For instance, Europe decided to ban combustion engines for automotive. Germany wants to revisit that ban. Germany wants to say, let's start building combustion engines again. I think the Netherlands will really be pushing for maintaining that ban. So you'll see a shift there as well. The other thing is, I think two things are important to mention. One specifically for the UK interesting is wind at sea. We've seen a decline on investments for wind parks at sea. Last week there was a news that there had been a tender for a big new wind farm at sea, and not one company showed any interest to start developing it. That has to do partially with the ending of any form of subsidy for wind. I think you can expect D66 to start subsidizing that again, pushing for wind at sea again. Obviously, added to that is investments in the grid, because the biggest challenge at the moment in the Netherlands isn't the amount of sustainable energy being produced, but rather the possibility to get the sustainable energy to households and to factories. We see new housing projects that just don't get a connection to the grid anymore because there's just too much energy stress on the grid. We see a horrible example of a zinc melting company who completely electrified their process to be completely sustainable, and then they couldn't get a hookup to the grid anymore, and they're now stuck in a limbo where they can be 100% sustainable as an industry, but they can't get a grid connection, and therefore they can't produce anymore. So I do think we'll see a lot of investments in the grid as well. Which also means a lot of investments in battery technology, in energy storage, and these kind of things. And lastly, and I know you're a big Rolls-Royce lover, the Netherlands still going on to build 2 new nuclear power plants that is something that up to about 6 years ago, D66 did not support at all. Rob Jetten has made that pivot, and we are still, and the party is still in support of building new nuclear power plants. And I think it's likely that that process will continue as well in the new coalition government.
Well, and it was so funny you saying that, and although there's different stances in the UK, very much the big bubbling issues in the UK. If I just the wind one, for example, we also had a tender about 3 or 4 years ago. No one bid for it because, again, they didn't feel there was enough money in the pot to make it workable. The likes of Ørsted have had huge financial problems in the UK and across the world. But what's interesting is the previous government under Rishi Sunak and then the current government under Keir Starmer have put a lot more money into it. They get paid whether the energy is used or not. It's created a big debate. And if our listeners want to hear more about that debate in person, obviously our title sponsor is The Spectator magazine, and at their Energy Summit, which I'll be chairing in 3 weeks' time, they will have a massive wind debate there. So whether you're from the Netherlands or the UK, come over to London, into Westminster, and have a good old ding-dong on wind. But the other thing I was interested in that you didn't touch on just before we go and look at 2030 a bit more is that obviously, Netherlands, unlike the UK, is a massive refining nation. So though we've done lots of podcasts about the UK closing refineries, part of it is because of that investment along that coastline, with the most famous being Pernis, which is just kilometres and kilometres. And if you're an energy fan, you ever want to take a boat trip, it's a wonderful thing to see. That is like
you're an oil man, aren't you? You'll always be an oil man, Alex.
How is the refining community feeling? Because even when I was in the Netherlands back in February, there was big changes in that the pension funds had pulled out of the refineries. A lot of independent companies or reformers or management buyouts were coming into place. I was just wondering how they might be feeling today, because obviously they are a significant employer and significant part of Dutch GDP.
Yeah. Well, I think in general, we've seen over, like, as you know, Shell has completely moved. Like, they still have a lot of refining and infrastructure in the Netherlands, but it's not without reason that Shell decided to move their main headquarters from the Netherlands to the UK. It was we always called it a Dutch-British company. We now don't see it as a Dutch company anymore in the Netherlands. It's a British company. It's also no longer Royal Dutch Shell. It's just called Shell because Shell decided to move away. And I think in general, if you're talking about one sector where people are going to be worried, I think that's it. I think it's a twofold system. On the one hand, I do think the approach for the likely coalition coming, or potential coalition coming up, but for any coalition with Rob Jetten as prime minister, I think the positive side for a lot of companies is that there is interest to invest even in industry to make a change. So, for instance, one of the things that's currently going on, Tata Steel, their big steel production facilities in near Amsterdam, in IJmuiden, like half of the political landscape in the Netherlands says, just close it down. It's too polluting. Let's move it away. The other half says, well, let's invest in, for instance, hydrogen production, create a big hydrogen factory there, and let's change the entire melting process into hydrogen fueled rather than coal fueled. D66 is on that side of it's fine to invest in industry and into the industry transition. So we're willing to spend public money on the internet on that kind of transitions, as long as it does lead and it's proven to lead to an actual sustainability advantage. So we're not funding to keep facilities open. We are funding to make that fundamental transition. So I think the same is true for funding, for instance, for the refineries, if they're making the change into ammonia production for hydrogen and these kind of things, where a lot of the old refineries are working on as well. I think there's a lot of interest in the Dutch government and also in D66 to help support these kind of transitions. At the same time, we have this frame, I don't know if you have it in the UK as well, what we call fossil subsidies, which is any kind of either tax benefit or subsidy for anything related to fossil fuels, whether it's the fact that you don't have to pay subsidy over or have to pay taxes over kerosene, your normal car fuel, you pay taxes, but if you fill up a plane, you don't pay the taxes over the kerosene. Like, we have this big push in the Netherlands to end all fossil subsidies, as it's called. That is something that is very much embraced by Rob Jetten. He took the lead when he was climate minister to get, I think, 12 countries together to create a shared plan to get rid of global fossil subsidies. So I do think a lot of oil companies and refinery companies are going to be skeptical and slightly worried what it means for their business model in the short term. I think in the short term, as long as you keep relying on oil, you might be very worried about what's going on. But I do think a lot of companies also see that there is a potential for a new business model past fossil fuels, and that is very much something that the Dutch government, I think, will keep on supporting companies to make that transition.
That's fascinating to hear. I think also where it sort of leads me nicely to is meeting 2030 targets. The other half of the Wolf Power Club, our government relations director Max, has just flown to Brazil to be at COP30, so we'll be hearing from him in the jungle next week. But it's whether it's 2030 targets in the EU, whether it's 2035 car emission targets, whether it's the 2050 Paris Accord targets. I think that everyone, including the Netherlands, is really struggling to change human behaviour. So we've seen in the UK electric car sales stagnate at around the 20% mark and way off the 30% mark they wanted to be at the end of this year, despite financial incentives, and they give them, take them away. They just don't quite know how to make it sustainable. We also see that every time there is a cost issue in the energy trilemma, i.e. people are feeling really poor from inflation, which I'm sure has hit the Dutch just like everyone else across Europe, suddenly energy is the big baddie because you're having exactly the same lifestyle, but essentially that there's high costs. And I was just wondering, therefore, what do you see the challenges in the next sort of 4 years for D66 to try and change that goal in 2030? And as you say, D66 have almost put themselves in the position where they can be legally fined and taken to court, but essentially changing human behaviour is hard. The good news is they've won an election with a guy who's obviously sustainability's core to his beliefs. But how do you think they'll meet the 2030 targets that are coming up with the EU? Because everyone seems to be struggling. It's in part why Germany are trying to loosen the targets and make it easier for their industry.
But that's interesting. Like, changing, you're absolutely right. Changing human behavior is tough. One of the things I find fascinating is I was here I live in Munich. I say here, so here in Munich there was the bi-yearly car show. IAA was a couple of weeks ago, the big show, and BMW launched their new hydrogen car. And I know you love hydrogen. I know you had the guy from Toyota Hilux on there. Like, hydrogen for personal automotive is a dead technology. In like 20 years from now, it's going to be irrelevant. So I was speaking to a guy who actually worked for a supplier. I won't mention the name, obviously, but worked for a supplier in the hydrogen sector for BMW. And he said something fascinating. He said, oh no, we all know, and he worked on hydrogen technology. He said, we all know that hydrogen for automotive is not going to be the future, but because there are so many BMW owners out there who just out of principle don't want an EV because they associate EV with wokeness. That's why BMW has to produce hydrogen cars, not because they're a good product, not because people from ideological perspective don't want an EV. I found that fascinating, and it says a lot about changing human behavior. You're absolutely right. The thing is, and this you mentioned in like just very briefly, you said giving incentives for EV and then taking them away again. I think one of the fundamental challenges policy-wise is the constant flipping of policies. So whether you're an individual deciding whether or not you want to buy a battery at home and buy solar panels on your roof and an EV, or whether you're a company investing often millions, if not more, in completely overhauling your production process, the one thing you need to know is that you'll have return on investment. So anytime policies keep shifting and shifting and shifting and shifting, you don't do anything and you don't meet your targets because, like, I'm investing in solar panels now, and 2 years from now the policies will change and it doesn't pay out. One of the things that frustrates a lot of people in the Netherlands, they invested in solar panels And one of the reason why that business case would pan out was because overproduction would be fed into the grid. And then we got into a discussion about net metering. And now people pay tax for the overproduction of the energy they sent into the grid, and they hardly get any money back because of the grid, the net congestion, the grid congestion. So the bottom line is people invested into solar panels and said, it would pay off in 10 years, and now it's not paying off anymore. And that's also one of the reasons why people are now hesitant to invest in a home energy storage system, because I have no idea if that business case is going to play out in 10 years. So I think one of the fundamental challenges to reach that 2030 goal, I think people are willing to make the change. I think people are willing to make that transition, but they need to know that if they invest in something now, that it's going to pay out, whether you're an industry or an individual, that it's going to pay off. The second part, of course, you're absolutely right. And that's, inflation and affordability. If you're struggling on a monthly basis to make ends meet, you're not going to have, 10,000 euros lying around to invest in a battery at home, or, 30,000 euros lying around to buy an EV. So obviously, policy focus should be less on specific, like you get a subsidy for a battery, but it should be tied, if you want to make it cost effective, it should be tied into the social economic position of the person that wants to buy that. So we've had a lot of people who are a lot of people who bought like a Model S Tesla, if it's fantastic that you could get a subsidy for it, but if you're buying a 120,000 euro car anyway, you probably don't need a 10,000 euro benefit to buy that. So rather than saying you get a subsidy for an electric car, maybe say you get a subsidy for an electric car if you buy a cheap model and you're in this or that income bracket, right? So I think that's a shift that we're going to see, make sure that these kind of policies help those people who actually would benefit it the most. But that's something that you need to do. But most importantly, make sure that you don't subsidize everything, but that when you subsidize something, that you create a business case that makes it worthwhile for 10 years. And that's, of course, and you know this more than anyone else, because you spent a couple of years in the Netherlands when we tended to have a new coalition government every year. Like we've had elections this year, and we had elections in 23, and we had elections in 21. So it's pretty much every 2 years at the moment. And if the complete political landscape changes every 2 years, so does the policy portfolio. And so does the business case where anything that the government is involved.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have elections. We just changed prime minister every 2 years.
Yeah, I know. That's even more difficult to understand for the outsider.
So I just want to touch on one thing before we get on maybe some lessons about coalition for the UK. But I want to focus on one thing. How are Dutch people feeling at the moment? So I'll give you an example of and it's very hard because when I go to these conferences, I obviously quite often normally meet successful energy leaders, people investing. But I got to say when I was in Rotterdam, it was in a completely different place to where I saw it pre-COVID. Seemed like big investment, beautiful food markets, beautiful halls. Like it actually felt like there was a real buzz in Rotterdam. I was in a kind of equivalent city to Rotterdam in the UK a few weeks ago, Sheffield, and it felt really sad. Like it felt like, pre-COVID, nice industrial restaurant pubs. I'm a big fan of Sheffield, but there was really empty high streets. There was boarded up shops. And Britain is feeling pretty poor at the moment, and Brits in general. And I think that's why they're seeking alternatives. You've just had an election of hope. Does that mean the Dutch are feeling all right? I'm not saying like amazing, but all right, because it definitely felt different, Rotterdam, going there than it did to, say, some of the UK cities that might be struggling a bit.
Well, let's stick the knife in the wound a bit further. You guys just should never have voted Brexit, and then you would have been so unhappy right now. No, just teasing you, Alex. No, I think Dutch generally tend to be relatively positive. If I compare the general mood out on the street in the Netherlands to here in Germany, where I am currently, I also see that the Dutch are a bit more optimistic by nature. I think here in Germany, the economic mood in general is really, really negative, and people really are very worried about specifically the future of automotive, but the entire German economy is built on automotive. So if that goes, so goes Germany. In the Netherlands, I think the general vibe is always a bit more can do. Let's just put some effort into it and make a difference. I think that's why yes we can or have gone well. Why it did resonate with people. Still, obviously, there are going to be a lot of people who are very skeptical, and that's inevitable. I think everywhere, but I do think there is a general consensus that people think like not just more positive, but there's no alternative. In the sense, there are so many challenges we have to overcome. We might as well give it a fair try, because like the housing crisis, the economic situation, climate, there's so many challenges facing us. If we just get trapped in negativism, we might as well stop trying. So I think that is a bit of the attitude you hopefully saw when you were in Rotterdam. I do think if you go to Rotterdam and tell people you compared them to Sheffield, they might get slightly upset, because Rotterdam people are very proud of Rotterdam and they feel that it's the most important city in Europe. So they might not agree with you. I think they would love to be compared to Liverpool or Manchester more than they would love to be compared to Sheffield. But nonetheless, I do think.
Just to be clear to our Dutch and Rotterdam listeners, Sheffield is the 5th largest city in the UK. I know Liverpool's more famous because of the Beatles and the football club, but it is a bigger city, Sheffield. But we'll have that debate as well.
Fair enough.
Obviously, not a lot of Sheffield United fans in the Netherlands.
No,
but
I've never met one.
So let's think about some lessons for the UK, and this bit is very poignant. So I have just come from an amazing, detailed breakdown of the UK election system. And one of our leading professors, John Curtis, who presents the TV channels and all the election swings, I was fortunate enough to be with him during conference season as he went through the numbers. And although we are a first past the post nation, and for our international listeners, similar to kind of the presidential school, but there's differences in a very broad terms, but essentially a bit like the US either gets the Republicans or Democrats. For a long time in the UK, you either got Labour or Conservatives, or certainly for the last century, there have been a few coalitions, very small ones, with Northern Irish Party under Theresa May and David Cameron's first government with the Liberal Democrats. But what Professor John Curtis was saying is the polls are showing at the moment that if the country has a general election today or between now and 2029, but there's many debates about whether the government gets to 2029 due to the economic situation, but essentially if there's an election today, 4 or 5 parties in the UK, even with first past the post, will get between 80 and 120 seats, and nowhere near the 320 that traditionally Labour or Conservatives get. So inevitably, the UK right now looks like it's going to face a coalition. So there's not going to be a big win for reform. Labour probably going to have big losses, but still have some of the highest number of seats. Conservatives are going to be, having their own challenges, but will still have a significant number of seats. But you could potentially have 5 parties with between 80 and 120 seats. What can we learn from the Dutch? Because I know you've got PR and proportional representation that forms your government, but what makes a good coalition, and how do you get to agreement? Because all of these things, in the Dutch system or the UK system, will happen after polling day, so us as the public don't get a say, or us as the business community don't get a say. What would you say as a seasoned Dutch political expert, and what D66 have to do now? How do you form a good coalition? Because as you said, having a government every 2 years isn't great. And as people mentioned, when I lived in the Netherlands, there was a good chunk of time where we had no government, but kind of everything still worked.
I often quote you on that, Alex. I often tell people that, you were there for a weird period of time as well. But you're right. So I think, well, first of all, like I checked the YouGov September. I think were the latest polls, and I think Reform were up above 300 in YouGov's polling. So in that sense, I think it'd be surprisingly positive if it ends up as you just described, with 5 parties all around 120, 130 or whatever. it's going to be difficult. I think one of the more important things, and I think this is a lesson that, for instance, Lib Dem learned the hard way when they were in the Cameron government. If you have a very clear division between a senior and a junior party in a coalition, that's always going to be horrible for the junior party. So it's always going to be the situation that if you provide 50 seats and the other party provides 300 seats, the end result is going to be that you're never going to really influence the policy making. You get blamed for everything that goes wrong, but your influence on the policy is very limited. So in general, I would say it's always important for any coalition is really determine what your position in the broader political landscape of that coalition. So for instance, in the Netherlands, one of the debates that's going on right now is VVD, Mark Rutte's former party, who lost a bit but did reasonably okay. They want the new coalition to be what they call the center-right coalition. So that's them with D66, with the Christian Democrats, and then one or two smaller, more right-wing parties. So it's going to be D66 would be the most left-wing party in that rather right-wing coalition. That for D66, even if you're the biggest party, would be a fundamental mistake, because it means that although you're the biggest party, you're constantly debating with four parties that are more right-wing than you, and then you would absolutely be blamed for the relatively right-wing course that government would then create, because you're constantly being pulled to the right than you are comfortable with yourself. So for D66, it makes most sense to go to what we call a middle or a center coalition, where they would work with VVD, would work with CDA, so with Rutte's conservative liberal party, and with the Christian Democratic Party more on the right of D66, but also with the Green Labour Party more on the left. Frans Timmermans' party, former European Commissioner. So I think in general, one of the situations that's going to be interesting for all the parties, if you're going to end up with a kind of coalition of 3 or 4 parties in the UK that are of similar size, all of those parties have to really realize not just like who do I trust on a personal level, but what's my position within the political spectrum of that coalition government? How can I pull it more to the right or more to the left, depending on my position? The second thing is form a coalition with people who actually want to get things done. And that is often the biggest challenge. As I started explaining, like a big part of the last coalition government was that I would say 3 out of the 4, well, at least 2 out of the 4 parties, the Farmers' Party and Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, were really not interested at all in getting anything done other than getting more likes for their next tweet. And that is going to destroy any coalition government. So look your opposing parties in the eye, really see, are they willing to get things? So as you know, I was also on a local level. I was a politician as well. I got elected as a party leader to city council twice. So I did coalition forming on a local level as well. First time I joined into the coalition, we were part of the coalition government on a local level. I was unhappy with how much we got done, because every time it became a little bit difficult, everyone just ran away and said, well, I don't want to take responsibility for this difficult decision. So in the second coalition government, although, everyone wanted us to join, I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Not because I don't like you as a person, not because I don't think we can create a nice platform on paper, but because when push comes to shove, when it's going to be difficult and we have to make unpopular decisions, you all are going to say, I don't want to take that responsibility. I do, so I'm not going to be part of it. And I think that's going to be the fundamental lesson for you guys. I can't judge whether a party like Reform is going to actually want to get things done or not. I don't know. But I would say if you're the Tories or if you're Lib Dem or whoever, be very wary of thinking, well, they're a popular party, so if we're going to work with them, at least we're going to be part of that popularity. Because if they don't want to get anything done, it's going to backfire massively in the next elections.
And I think that's what the Lib Dems found when they went into coalition with the Conservatives in 2010, was that they had to give up to get the proportional representation vote, or we called it AV, alternative voting system. They had to give up their stance on education fees for university students. And that probably single policy meant for a long time, until the recent successes they've had, they were always seen as the party that let students down, and that got very vocal support. And obviously that went to young professional communities because those students got jobs. So it was a very, very tough time for them. But leads nicely to America, because one person who did very well at the coalition was the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Nick Clegg. He went to the States, got a massive role at Meta. He's obviously recently left it, but he was at the beloved Wimbledon Book Festival, where we took some people to see Jeremy Hunt. But I want to get into the global context and beyond, about where you see D66. Obviously, for our listeners, if you don't know, Ad has been a successful author after 2 US elections and after the 2016 election. I can't pronounce the Dutch name, so I'll say the English name. You wrote a book called The Battle of America, and obviously you saw in person that Trump wave of him getting into power in 2016. Obviously, then he's back again now, 9 years on. How do you think DC66 engage with Donald Trump? Every country I ever go to thinks they've got a special relationship with America. But obviously there's a huge amount of culture between the Dutch and the Americans, from the fraternity systems at university to that shared history of New York. There's a lot of history between the two countries, just like UK, US. But in a global context, you've seen that what's happened in the US, D66. What do you think the Dutch government's relationship will be with America?
You're right. So our former Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, he was very skilled now in his role as NATO Secretary General as well. He was very skilled during Trump's first term in buttering up Trump enough to get those invites to the White House and to play that role as one of the major representatives of Europe, in DC. I don't think necessarily Rob Jetten will play that same role. I think he is more principled, less of he's not the guy to grease the wheels. He's more principled, I think, in that sense. I think also the effect is he's very pro-European, and I think he will push towards more and more of a strong European foreign policy versus a strong Dutch national foreign policy. So I don't see yet making his pilgrimages to the White House and dancing in the enormous new ballroom that is replacing the East Wing anytime soon. I think he's very comfortable in letting Europe take that lead, and he's more focused at making sure that he asserts his position in Europe to make sure that the messages that we use to go to DC are the right ones, rather than wanting to do it himself. I think he is very much aware that over the last 2 years, the Dutch coalition government really retreated to a large extent from the negotiation table in Europe as well. Obviously, Geert Wilders' Freedom Party has for a long time advocated for a Dutch withdrawal from the EU, an exit, as we call it. He didn't officially anymore over the last coalition government, but he's very Eurosceptical, and that has undermined the Dutch position in Brussels a lot. We were always under Rutte, we were always, punching above our weight when it came to European decision making. We lost that position, and I think when it comes to foreign policy, Rob Jetten's goal is going to be make sure that we get back to that position of being a dominant factor in Europe. And leveraging that also to influence European foreign policy more than him making the pilgrimages to, which is now the Gold House rather than the White House in DC.
And one thing on energy specifically, obviously Trump has come very supportive of the hydrocarbons industry. Obviously the line that gets quoted again and again is drill baby drill, but also he's being pretty aggressive towards wind, various policies that, essentially have challenged the wind sector, banned various bits of wind and so on inland. How will that work with D66, who are pretty pro-sustainability?
Well, as Trump puts it, I think looking at a windmill gives you cancer. So, his position on the thing is pretty clear. for obviously, like energy independence and European energy independence is a major push when it comes to energy policy for D66 and for Robiette. So I think by and large he wants to also limit the import of liquefied natural gas. He wants to limit all forms of carbon fuels, not just from a sustainability perspective, but also very much from a strategic autonomy, geopolitical independence position. So I think that would also obviously looking towards the US and towards the U.S. Gas production, fracking, these kind of things. I think he'd advocate independence for Europe more than anything, and that includes advocating for wind and the European push for renewables, just for our own independence. I think the idea in general is as long as Europe doesn't only have very high energy prices, but also relies on its energy production, whether it's from Russia or from the US or even from Canada, and I don't think there's any animosity towards Canada in itself, but just the idea of relying on outside energy sources, I think will be very much a priority for Robiette and his government.
Now, our time is coming towards the end, Shane, because I could be here all day, but we've both got to do business outside of the podcast.
Yes, exactly.
So I just wanted to touch a bit on future trends. Your company very kindly hosted us during Climate Week and a group of other thought leaders as we discussed many big energy things and future trends. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with Get Focus and some of the studies that are emerging on the energy sector that you guys have been sharing since Climate Week in London?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for your listeners, what we do, we've created a model where we use AI to analyze patent data to determine how quickly technologies are improving, and therefore we can forecast which technologies will dominate in the future. So one of the things, I already gave you one of our insights. We've been looking at automotive a lot. We work for a lot of automotive companies as well. And based on the analysis that we made, and we make our analysis also for NASA, we make our analysis for the US Department of Defense, for big companies like Shell or like BASF, or all these kind of big companies, Unilever, to mention some of the companies that you know very well in the UK. And one of the things that we found is that, and I mentioned this before, the future of automotive, it's not sustainable fuel, it's not hydrogen. We know by a fact that battery electric vehicles, that the technology, so the price per kilometer driven, is improving so much faster in specifically pure silicon anodes, or not just pure, but silicon anode technology in general, graphene enhanced silicon anodes. So when it comes to energy density, the future of automotive, also sodium ion as a battery chemistry, that's improving so much faster also than hydrogen, that we know that the future of automotive isn't going to be hydrogen. It's not going to be some kind of e-fuels. It's going to be battery electric. The other thing I find interesting is that still the fastest improving technology for energy is solar. And I know people think of it as like it's something that happened already. It's a transition that happened already. But if you look at the price per kilowatt hour produced, solar is improving faster than anything else. Fusion is a fantastic pipe dream. Every decade, it's going to happen the next decade. And then a decade later, it's going to happen the next decade. And a decade later, it's going to happen the next decade. So that's improving very slowly. I think these are fundamental things. And because of better energy, or because of battery technology improving fast, I think it pays to really look at the kind of companies that increase production efficiencies. I was at a Munich-based startup last week, Excellion. They developed an AI model to help scrap waste in battery production. So to create like 10%, 15% more efficiency when it comes to using natural resources in creating batteries. That efficiency improvement is so fundamental to really power that energy transition. So I think that's going to be a fundamental thing to look at as well.
So I think this is another debate that's going to be massive at the Spectator Energy Conference. We're very kindly of the CEO of Bosch, Dr. Stefan Hoffman, and their company cover all those technologies. We're going to have Shell Mobility in that talk, and we're going to have famous YouTuber Harry Metcalf bring it to life. But can I say that if anyone wants to get in touch with Get Focus, I'll put their website in the notes below. Ad's very active on LinkedIn like we are, and I'm sure you'd be happy if companies want to look at where they should be doing their trends to get in touch with you guys about getting access to some of the areas Get Focus can really develop people. But we've got a few quick fire questions before we let our Dutch master leave us today. So our first question is that we ask a lot of our guests: if you could invest your time and money in one area of the energy sector, what would it be?
I already mentioned it. Silicon anodes, specifically silicon anodes, is what's revolutionizing the battery tech domain.
Now, because we've got someone that's been so embedded with D66 and has got his glorious photo going as the election result happens, is that what one achievement, other than actually forming a coalition, would you like D66 to do in the next months? And we appreciate there's a few months to go with forming a coalition, but say once they form that coalition, what one thing would you like to do in the first 12 months?
Yeah, that one coalition in itself would be an achievement in and of itself. But nonetheless, there's one major challenge in the Netherlands right now, and that has specifically to do with nitrogen, from the agricultural industry, but also from automotive. Like nitrogen deposition really has had detrimental effects to nature, and therefore pretty much no permits are given out to build anything anymore as soon as there is nitrogen involved in the process, which is everything. So I think if the coalition government can solve that problem, that is vital, because that would also allow for construction of houses. It would allow for a construction of new infrastructure. It would allow for the redesigning factories. So I think that's one major thing. It's been a political debate for a long time. How do we deal with nitrogen deposition? Also, in a way of limiting the space agriculture takes in that whole debate. I think if they can solve that, I think that's going to accelerate a lot of things.
Interesting. And then our final question before I let you leave to, help Get Focus change the world even better than it is today, is the following. What's the next big collaboration that the Netherlands and the UK should pursue together? We've done many great things together as two nations. Obviously, we're no longer part of the same trading group as, out of the EU. But it's fair to say that our generation that grew up debating each other at university are now business leaders, politicians, thought leaders. What can we do together? Because I think the friendship's very strong, but how can we do more stuff together? And what would you say the two nations should focus on?
Well, obviously, we share the North Sea. So when we're talking about energy and we're talking about wind at sea, I do think there's a fantastic potential there. The other thing is we've been focused so much on Brexit, and obviously I would love to see you guys rejoining, but let's move past that debate and see how the UK and Europe can work together effectively. And I think the Netherlands always played that role. So when we talk, and we've seen this during Ukraine, obviously, where Europe and the UK very much taken a joint approach in defense policy. But I think we can do that in way more things. You don't have to be part of the European Union to be part of a shared decision-making process. So I think the Netherlands should play that role. We always tried to be the linking pin between the UK on the one hand and France and Germany on the other hand. When you guys were still part of the European Union, we can also play that role in the current situation. So I would love that, and I think using wind and at sea. Also, there are like tidal energy potentials at sea. Solar at sea is also a potential. So I think we could use the North Sea as our shared power generation unit. I think we could build on that. Absolutely.
Ad, it's been wonderful. So for all our listeners today, we've had insight into the Dutch election of hope. It's no longer a far-right party, but someone in the centre in D66 that wants to form a coalition. They've got sustainability at its heart. And our speaker, Adriana, today, not only did he spend 6 years with the party, but he saw a Rob Ditton go from youth leader to position in government, to leading the party to this election success. And we now have an opportunity of hope. The Dutch seem to be the most optimistic people in Europe right now. I am the happiest man in energy. So I think the only right conclusion is that in the near future, once the coalition's government's formed, we get the Dutch Prime Minister onto the podcast. But it's been amazing insight from Ad today. And also the work they're doing at Get Focus is looking at energy trends, not just in automotive, but what the Dutch and British can do together. Ad, can I thank your time from all of the Wolf Power Club? And I look forward to meeting up in London soon. And it should maybe be the Spectator Energy Summit on the Monday, the 24th of November.
I'll think about it. Awesome. It was a pleasure, Alex.